Thank you, April. I appreciate the invitation and the privilege of being here with you all. I've been on the campus a couple of times, but never with you leaders of the community, and I appreciate that and your trust in me. She asked me to tell you a little bit of my story, just because it kind of tells you why we get where we're going. Some of you have planned your life. You went through high school, college, and you're exactly where you planned to be. Others of you had accidents and incidents that happened in your life, and you arrived where you're at because of those outside forces. And that's kind of what happened to me. I was a nurse, and I had my career planned out, but I went on vacation to the Cayman Islands, and I met a man, and yes, I did that thing. I married him a couple of months later and moved to a Caribbean island. And it was lovely, and then it wasn't, because a major hurricane came through, wiped us out, and we had to recover from that. So when we left that island, we said, where are we going to go? And we said, well, why don't we go through connections? We ended up in Sutherland Springs. And my husband's a pastor of the second church in that community. I don't know if you remember, but in 2017, a mass disaster happened there, and 26 people died in the church. Not our church, but the church down the road. And we were, again, the recovery people. And it was amazing how we kind of knew what the next step was, because we had been through it before. My husband retired after a time, and we moved away, and shortly after that I got a call from the same people that had helped in Sutherland Springs and said, can you come to Uvalde? Because you kind of know where it goes and what's been. And that's how trauma happened to me, and I have become an expert in a field I never wanted to really know about. But I have been through several and learned as much as I could from them, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. Trauma is unavoidable. It's all around you. As that has been in my life, I know that you've experienced it too, whether it be personal, in a community, or national. 70% of Americans have experienced at least one major trauma in their life. So in this room, we have 6 tables. If we had 7, it would be a good portion. If we had 10 tables, I guess. I can't do the math. Somebody tell me what 70% of 6 tables is. Who's the math expert in the room? All right. As an emergency room nurse for 10 years, I saw my share of trauma and several mass incidents during that time, as I told you. Traumatic events are so frequent they seem normal, but they never feel normal. Somehow they affect us in a way that it just stays with us. But what we do with that trauma, how do we normalize something that's so unwanted, so surprising, so unplanned? We either stuff it, we forget it, we get stuck with it, we walk away, we pretend it didn't happen, or we can learn from it, let it grow us in our ability to be resilient, and find a way to be stronger, perhaps for the next experience that's coming down the road. As community leaders, you are all in the business of providing the best possible environment to help learning happen. And I know that I'm not telling you anything you don't know. As faculty in this college, you're pouring into the next generation, trying to make them equipped for life, work, and resilience for those unexpected events. And I applaud you for that, because that is not easy in this ever-changing world that we're in. It cannot be done by one of you, although each of you has a very important part in it. It's daunting to know that 50% of those in America that are 25 and under have experienced a major trauma in their life of some kind. Psychologist Thais Gibson from Canada, I'm Canadian, so I have that reference and that connection, has done some research, and she says 90% of the behavior that we exhibit, or our behaviors, are controlled by the subconscious. So if you imagine an iceberg, and the top is just 10% showing out, that 10% is formidable. It's impactful. Think the Titanic, it's big. But the major power is the 90% that's under the water. And in every person that we meet, what we see, what's presented, what's there by sheer determination and self-will and I'm going to get this done kind of grit, that's just the 10%. The other underneath part is the part that controls the behaviors. And sometimes we blame people for all those things that are under the surface, when really they're not even aware that that's what's pushing them to behave the way they behave or to do the things they do. I want you to remember this phrase: until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we'll call it fate. Until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives from underneath, and we'll call it fate. When really, those of you in psychology, I'm sure you're doing this, but as we become aware of what's underneath the surface, we have far more ability to change our beliefs, and that will change what is above the surface. Not knowing what's below the surface is what your students present to you, and that's a challenge for you as leaders. You all know that what is presented is often not the true picture. I'm sure you've heard of many heart-wrenching stories. Some you know, some you don't, but you all see the signs. Perhaps you see disengagement, lack of interest, absenteeism, anger, withdrawal, addiction. Signs that all is not well. But why? Trauma responses can present like the tip of that iceberg, hiding a much bigger problem below the surface. So how do we as leaders help? The most important thing that we can do and most important thing that we can provide is safety. Physical safety, evidently, that's at the base of Maslow's hierarchy. We all know that. But psychological safety is just as important and is sometimes harder to do. But it is important to be a safe place, and that will tone down the hypervigilance, the anxiety, and calm some of the fears that the students are feeling. As I said, I married a man who lived in the Caribbean, and we hunkered down for a Category 5 hurricane, and 80% of the homes on the island were majorly destroyed and were uninhabitable for the next year, 6 months to a year. So in an island, you can't go to the next town. You can't even fly off the island. You're stuck. You're there. So I was working in a hospital, and during that storm, 800 people took shelter in a 75-bed hospital. Most of them didn't need care. Most of them needed a warm blanket, a warm drink, and there wasn't enough chairs, so they were just lined up down the hallways. And it was all fine until the power went off. And about 2 o'clock that morning, one of our doctors brought his father in, and he had had a major heart attack, ended up on a ventilator in the ICU on the 2nd floor. So all was well until the power went out. And we scrambled quickly, found a battery-operated pack, and put it on, thought we were okay. 20 minutes later, the battery's dead. What are we going to do? So the nurses are bagging him, taking turns, because you can do about 15 minutes, and then your arm is tired, because it's not something you do all the time. And amazingly, remember those 800 people that came through the door? They lined up outside that man's door. They watched for 15 minutes. And then they bagged him for 15 minutes, and they continued on. 96 people bagged that man for 36 hours, and he was on the first plane off the island. He lived, he was well, and he came back a month later, and he said, I don't know who to thank. I don't even know who you are. I don't even know the names. But isn't that an amazing story of how we can turn things around by just stepping up and doing our part? I see that as a beautiful picture of how a community of trauma-informed people can help traumatized individuals hold on, make it through until it's better. So traumatized, what is that? How does that present? What is that like? What about that person, that student with a history of trauma that you may or may not know about, but you recognize the signs that we mentioned? The one who always shows up late, disheveled, looking tired. Are they lazy, undisciplined? Or did they not sleep because they're disturbed by very disturbing dreams and nightmares? The substance abuser, is it just for fun? Is he just fooling around? Or are they numbing something that they can't quite forget? The one who doesn't seem to care about their grades, is there a script running in their heads from the past that says, you are stupid, 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 you will never amount to anything? So that's kind of what real life trauma looks like. And it sometimes we punish it, we shame it without knowing what's below the surface. And I know, I get it, that there are rules and there are standards that we're all setting, but let's be compassionate in getting there. A few months ago, this is a real story from a few months ago, I had a relationship with the EMS, and on a weekend, on a Sunday, somebody called me and said, can you come down and evaluate this employee? And I asked what had happened, and they had actually been called into the office because there was late call-ins, showing up not quite 100%, showing up with alcohol on the breath, calling in 2 hours before a shift when you should have called, you have to make preparations, you need more time than that. So called in for a disciplinary action and to make a plan forward. But instead of being hard-nosed and pointing the finger, he said, I notice you're not behaving in the way, you're not performing in the way that you used to. Tell me what's happening. Just an open-ended question. No judgment, no shame, just an open-ended question to let somebody explain. And what came out was a lot of trauma that had been piling up, and she was no longer able to cope. And so she was coping with what she could, and it wasn't working, didn't mesh together with her job. So from that, we got her some help. We got her medication, we got her counseling, we got her reprieve, and we were able to turn that story from what was suicidal in potential to being a much happier ending, just by being aware that maybe there's something going on that I didn't think about. Sometimes asking an open-ended question from a place of empathy can bring the answer you don't want, but is so desperately needed. But you cannot help what you don't recognize. If you never recognize that there's something else going on, if you've predetermined that this is just bad behavior, you're never going to recognize that there might be something else going on. Trauma-informed is to be truth-informed, to look for that piece of truth that will help you explain that unexplained behavior. Rather than turning a blind eye, labeling a person, or worse yet, ridiculing the oddities, let's be helpful, be truthful, and compassionate. So what is trauma? I'm going to have to read this one because it's several sentences, and I'll read it twice because it's so packed with information. But a trauma-informed approach involves actively recognizing and responding to the potential impact of trauma on an individual, creating a safe and supportive environment where people feel empowered to take action and choices, with key elements including safety, fostering trust and transparency, offering choices and control, practicing empathy and compassion, and being aware of the potential triggers, all the while avoiding re-traumatizing the individual. That's a lot. Let me read it one more time. A trauma-informed approach involves actively recognizing and responding to the potential impact of trauma on an individual, creating a safe and supportive environment where people feel empowered to make choices. The key elements include prioritizing safety, fostering trust and transparency, offering choices and control, practicing empathy and compassion, and being aware of potential triggers, all the while avoiding re-traumatizing that individual. So let's talk about some of those things in a little more detail. Actively recognizing impacts of trauma on an individual. Sometimes we're not going to hear the story, but we're going to see the effects, so let's recognize that. Recognize that there may be things that I'm doing that are triggering that. After Sutherland Springs, we were doing a community fair for the first time, and one of our favorite things was a TNT race, which was a bicycle pump to pump up a balloon, and then whoever got there first got the prize. While we were practicing, we were all setting up, we thought, let's just make sure it all works. So we pump, 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 pop. Everybody stopped what they're doing and looked at us, and it's like, the thing is broken, we're gonna have to put it away. Not realize, doing that thing where we just don't realize the effects of something that we're doing is re-traumatizing or triggering somebody in the environment. Number 2 is responding to the symptoms with compassion. Responding with empathy and understanding, avoiding judgment or blame, and building trust by being open and honest, respecting boundaries, and following through on promises. Sometimes those boundaries will be that they don't want to tell their story, and that's okay. We can instead ask, how can I make this experience comfortable for you from where you're coming from, with never knowing what brought that to that place. We don't have to dig for all that things. That's not our place necessarily. But asking, how can I make you comfortable in this situation is a great way to start that conversation. Number 3 is creating a physically and emotionally safe place where others feel secure and protected, partnering with individuals, listening to their experiences and perspectives if they want to share. So feeling heard, being seen, and accepted for who I am is all of our desire. We all want that. We want that amongst our comrades. We want that in whatever setting we're in, our families. And that's not always what happens. But we can be that safe place if we choose to be. And number 4, empowering the individuals to make choices, allowing them to make choices that we can in this environment. I know there are rules and there are ways we do tests, there are ways we do classes, but just take, for instance, what if you have seat assignments, or if you have somebody sitting close to the front and they're nervous and they're not paying attention and they keep fidgeting, and you have a conversation and say, what would make you more comfortable to sit in the class? And you heard, if I can sit in the back row where nobody's behind me, I'll be able to sit still. Because trauma makes you uncomfortable. If you're in law enforcement, you know that too. You never sit in a restaurant where your back's to the door, all that stuff. But that little adjustment can make that person comfortable, so learning can happen. Just thinking about those things, opening the door to those conversations is a great first step. I want to talk about PTSD just a little bit because it's hard to talk about trauma without discussing PTSD. But first of all, nobody would expect that you would manage PTSD, treat PTSD, or even maybe identify it. But if you recognize some of the symptoms, you can help that person get to the place where they get the help they need. Not every trauma develops into PTSD. Not every trauma experience develops into a traumatized person. Some don't. Let me give you an example. Imagine that this is the world. Well, let's just say America. Let's just say this is America. And all these little beads represent the population. 3/4 of the population is going to be handling life and going on and being resilient. So I have 3 cups of clear beads. But then there's a fourth. 25% of the population will have some kind of, not just trauma, and maybe not PTSD, but some kind of mental struggles. Mental health is 1/4, 1 in 4 will have some kind of mental health struggle. So let me mix these up. I'm sorry, this is very loud on the mic. So this is our world. And let's say that this cup represents your workplace. I'm just going to blindly reach in here, grab a few beads. What do you see? There's some blue ones in there, a good portion, probably more than you would expect. And all I'm saying is that if you're not the one that's standing out, being different, being blue in a clear world, you're probably rubbing shoulders with someone who is, teaching someone who is. It might be in your family, it might be the person behind the counter at H-E-B, but you're probably rubbing shoulders. So let's keep that in mind and be aware and be kind. So what does PTSD look like if it happens to be that one of those mental conditions, those mental health struggles is PTSD? PTSD is that person who has experienced something that now disrupts their equilibrium in their mind or their body. It might be expressing itself through bodily functions, or it might just be in the brain. But these are some things you can look for. Intrusive thoughts. Thoughts that we're doing this and all of a sudden something else takes over and takes us somewhere else. Avoiding external places that remind us or trigger us. Avoiding internal places, things that we think or feel, avoiding those places entirely and just numbing or using fantasy to escape. Perhaps there's feelings that we avoid because we just don't want to go there, we can't handle it. Distressing dreams, which can disrupt the night, remember? Distorting thoughts where it's not really the way it happened, but that's the way we see it. Memory lapses, kind of important in college to remember stuff, right? Prolonged, strong emotional states like irritability, anger, crying, but they're prolonged, not just a moment, but prolonged. Inability to enjoy positive emotions or an inability to enjoy experiences that previously were very positive. The things I used to have fun doing, they're just gone. I can do the same things and there's no enjoyment for me. Reckless behavior. That's one to note. It's kind of a high on the scale. If you notice somebody just doing reckless things that would be harmful or just throwing away money or things that are out of character, it's kind of a sign that perhaps we need to have a conversation, perhaps we need to get somebody help. Hypervigilant problems, like I mentioned, not wanting to put our back to the door. Problems sleeping, hallucinations, and suicidal thoughts. All of these things, you may not see them, but you might, if you ask questions, you might hear some of the things that describe those things. And if that does, sometimes that person doesn't need you to discover it all with them. Maybe you could just say, if there was someone that could help you, would you go if I went with you? If you just, I'm going to tell you right now that when people come through the resiliency door, the resiliency center door, where we do counseling of many types, from child play therapy to deep trauma therapy groups, but the hardest part to do is to pick up the phone the first time and make an appointment. or to walk through that door the very first time and say, I'm here to make an appointment with a counselor. It's very hard to do. I always congratulate them on their courage. But wouldn't that be easier if someone they trusted and was a safe place said, I'll go with you on your first visit. I'll just wait in the waiting room, but I'll go with you. It's just one simple way to get somebody to the help they need without being that person yourself. We don't have to fix it. There are 3 things to remember about PTSD that separate it from trauma. And that is that it's not PTSD till it's been around for more than a month. So if it happened this weekend and I'm upset because I had a near car accident on Friday night, now that's not PTSD. It may feel like PTSD, but it's gone by the 3rd week of the month. That's different. Number 2, it must be problematic and interfere with my everyday life. It must affect my relationships or my job. It must interfere with life in order to be identified as PTSD. And thirdly, it cannot be related to substance abuse or some kind of diagnosed illness that you have in your body. So those 3 things, and I'm not asking you to diagnose that, I'm just asking you to put that in your mind, that if you can help someone get the help they need, you may have rescued someone. There are some myths about PTSD that I just want to briefly, I'm going to go over 3 of them. One is that it only happens to people in combat. Not true. Actually, our trauma therapist that's here was a combat vet, and she said she was amazed at how what she saw here was so similar to combat because it was so violent. But it's not true. The fact is that it could be right next door, and what's traumatic to one is not necessarily traumatic to another, and what causes PTSD to one is not necessarily what happens to the next. Trauma should never be compared. That's unfair. Number 2, PTSD has no cure. Once you have it, you're stuck with it for life. And this same therapist that I mentioned, she came out of combat, she came out of PTSD, suicidal thoughts, all those things, thinking of suicide every single day for months, to where she said, I'm going to find out what's going on here. She went into therapy to prove that you can get over PTSD, and she has proved that here in our community. If you're familiar with it all, there's a PTSD measure scale, because we have to measure things in science. And if you have a certain number, you qualify as having PTSD. And some people were off the charts, and within 10 months of seeing her, they don't register on the numbers. They're less than 30. So I'm saying there are evidence-based treatments that do work. Not one size fits all, not one treatment fits everybody, but there are evidence-based treatments that do treat PTSD. People with PTSD are not resilient. There's another myth that's out there. They're just weak, they're damaged, something happened, they can't change. But the fact is that PTSD is not something that's wrong with you, it's something that happened to you. It actually shrinks your brain to have PTSD. Physical MRIs will show it shrinks the brain. Well, if it shrinks, guess what? It can grow. So we can reverse that. Enough about PTSD and some of our services. On the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are traumatized, who are in traumatic events, who are never traumatized by them. They walk away. They go for a run. They drink a beer. They talk with a friend. They sleep for 8 hours, and they get up the next morning, and they're okay. And that's good, too. If you've ever been in a near accident and had that shaking response where you just you clench your fist, you hold your breath, just wet, whatever else you do, I'm not going to go through the whole list, but that's the fight, flight, or freeze response. But, it doesn't happen. That car just missed you and went on. You still feel like it was real, but it didn't really happen. And so for those people, usually they can get over that before the month is over, and they can deal with life. But remember that 50% of your students did not have a perceived trauma, they had an actual trauma. 50% of the people 25 years and under have had an actual trauma somewhere in their history. That's very young to have had that much trauma. To be trauma-informed, it's not just for those that survive abuse or rape. It's certainly appropriate for those situations, but it's for the everyday person who has experienced some kind of trauma, and people need to remember that and treat them accordingly. Not with kid gloves, but with compassion. So what can we do? There's some things that we can do in our classrooms, in our relationships, in our staff meetings. We can be self-aware. Sometimes we're just not aware of how we're perceived, and what we're doing is actually shutting someone down. Maybe we see that they have this behavior that's distracting, and we yell at them, shame them, and they calm right down. Have we been effective? Well, we controlled the behavior, but what have we done to the person? So if we're self-aware, the things that we may do that may exacerbate the trauma for another person. Things like pen flicking, darting eyes, never looking you in the eye, fidgeting. Those don't produce a calm if you're going to encounter somebody and have a conversation with them about their grades or how things are going. So if we can bring our own judgment and fear and put it away, and we can bring acceptance, calm, and peace into the room, it's much more easy to have that conversation that will help them have a safe place to express to us. Number 2 is something physical. Co-regulation or attunement, emotional regulation, some call it. But if I stand in front of you and I take a deep breath every sentence, and I'm moving my hands at a calm pace instead of fidgeting all the time, just calmly breathe. If I did this here for 3 or 4 minutes, I can guarantee that 50% of the room would be breathing slower just with me. It's called attunement. If you slow your breathing down, if you slow down the pace that you're talking, there's a response in the person that's with you. You can do it with your kids, you can do it with your husband, but you can definitely do it with your class also. Also, if you know about box breathing, I don't know, at the high school and the junior high, they said, we don't want to hear any more about the breathing. But there is a thing called box breathing, which I do it when I go to the doctor's office, and I slow my blood pressure down before they ever come in to take my pressure, because everybody has white coat syndrome, you know. If you want to regulate that, just take a moment and go in for the count of 4. Breathe in. 1. Hold for 4, 2, 3, 4. Exhale for 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold for 4, 2, 3, 4. That's once. If you do that 3 times over, your blood pressure, your pulse will come down for most people. So it's a very weak, and if you have those little gadgets that I put out on the table, there's one that's a ring that you can rub up and down your fingers. That's one way to do it. There's another one that's just textured. You can stick that to the back of your phone and just rub it on the back of your phone when you feel yourself getting stressed. So those are all things that you can do to bring your own stress down. There's stress balls as well. Things that you can do that you know will help regulate your physical response will pass on to the person that's sitting in front of you. A couple of other things you can do is to sigh deeply. Stretching, just stretching, you know, you don't have to say anything, just stretch. And, you know, you're releasing your tension, and you'd be surprised how that is mirrored in the person in front of you. If you're having somebody in your office who's having a full-blown anxiety attack, they can't finish their sentences, they're crying or whatever, one little trick that I have learned is to grab one of those squeezable packs, ice packs, that when you squeeze them, they turn cold. Or if you have a fridge, you have an ice pack. But if you just put that skin to skin on their chest, that will actually it's kind of like when in the old movies when they were hyperventilating and they would slap them across the face. Well, that's kind of the other option. So let's just put the cold pack on their chest and ask them to do the breathing for 3 or 4 times, and many times that will be effective for something like that. So that's self-awareness, co-regulation, and the third one is understanding. Maybe accommodations for test taking, some of them we've discussed already. Taking breaks during intense experiences so that we can just regulate, bring it down a little bit. In the emergency room, we used to call it taking a non-homicidal break, because we don't smoke anymore. So there was the walk outside to go smoking used to actually be helpful to get out of the situation for 5 minutes. Now we just go for a little walk to kind of bring our own stress level down. Number 4 is taking your college or your class or your staff to the next level, and that is with training to be actually trauma-informed. It involves walking through the building and seeing where we've placed things, how that can be changed. It involves our process. It involves choices, the choices we can give. There's much more to it than I'm telling you today, and there are people who are trained to give that. It can be from 4 hours to 2 days. It depends how intense you want to be about it, but please contact April. April will contact me, and we'll try and get that arranged for you if you really want to be trauma-informed and certified in that process.
Trauma-informed care looks different for everyone in every situation. In some cases, it might be as simple as explaining something and why we're having to do something instead of just directing somebody to do it. Another example of trauma-informed care might include allowing an anxious person to take a friend or a dog with them into the situation as support during that procedure or during that exam. Another one is asking permission rather than giving a directive. Instead of saying, this is what we're going to do now, say, just get yourself ready because if it's okay, we're going to do this now. Just turning it around so that it's a question to ask permission rather than a directive. Or responding with compassion to someone's expression of being uneasy or resistant or hesitant to follow the plan for the experience. Trauma-informed culture is created by those who are in it. A leader, as you are today here, you are leaders in creating that culture here on this campus. One thing that we need to remember is okay not to be okay. That's one of the ways that we express that it's okay not to be okay. Instead of saying, suck it up, buttercup, come on, we got to do this. Everybody from the custodian to the dean can make a difference in someone's life by being compassionate, taking a step back, asking open-ended questions. I've given you an overview of what it looks like to be trauma-informed, but it takes the whole village. It takes everyone. Remember that man who had the heart attack and 96 people begged him for 36 hours and he went off the island and he came back better? Do you know that he didn't know a single person's name? If you ask him, he didn't know anybody's name. He didn't know who to thank. But looking back, we know that every single person made a difference in his life. Every single person who took the time to watch and engage and do their part made a difference in helping that man get to the place where he was better. And we can do the same for people who are traumatized or who need a little help. If we're trauma-informed, we can be that person who does 15 minutes of work to help them get to a better place. Thank you.